Hello, welcome to Varn Blog Solo. Today there's no reading, there's no specific event. There's a lot of chatter. I'm often criticized on this channel for not being specific in who I'm calling out. The reasons for that are manifold. One, a lot of the time I think there is a rat beef mentality to cultural criticism, and it's easy to grow your brand by the drama of those kinds of interactions. Crowder versus Ben Shapiro, TYT versus Jimmy Dore. The funny thing about it is it often misses the larger picture. I don't think it deliberately misses the larger picture. There's two ways in which one can read any situation, and often they're both true. I worked a lot with immigration issues over the past decade, and I sat down and asked a person very close to me who worked with me why we think so many people had left. And half of it was opportunism and half of it was despair. But the results are the same. Despair was after fighting on it all the way back into the Obama administration. Some people all the way back to when Homeland Security started handling immigration. Nothing ever gets done. One way or the other. It becomes a political football in which people can hold over your head and not fix. Roe versus Wade in the courts are the same way. The people have the power, the people being the Democratic Party, when this happens, and yet they use it to tell you need to give them more power. Yet, in the past, when they had the biggest supermajority that any electoral party had seen since the 1950s, they didn't utilize it for any of this either. Why? Because motivating people off of negative partisanship and crisis is about the only way to get political legitimization. It's a form of cultural hegemony now. The move that I think the philosopher Michael Sandel is actually right about is from civic republicanism and a shared common culture to a blank administrative state to a state that is constantly in crisis, even when it doesn't need to be. Now, there are real crises on the horizon. I'm not telling you there isn't. But most people who live in North America, anywhere in North America, Mexico, United States, Canada, are actually in a better geographical shape than a lot of other places. And yet you wouldn't know that, nor do they seem to govern that way. Why is that? The frailty of the discourse seems to be to keep people constantly agitated and yet not agitated about anything important. Most of the cultural artifacts that people live and die on aren't the things that people actually will be able to change and to build the capacity to change. I listened to a podcast. I'm, again, not causing shade by calling things out directly, but it's been a whole time making fun of the Rage Against the War Machine. Now, we can talk about the motives of the people at the Rage Against the War Machine, and they are varied, and a lot of them are bad, and a lot of them are good. There's a whole lot of guilt by association, and well, these people are pro-Russia. And look, I get it too. I get just as angry when people come at me when I am insufficiently pro-Russian in the way I critique this war. They'll tell you you're doing a coward's way out as opposed to projecting onto some other field. But let's be very clear about something right now. The critique was leveled that the anti-war movement had no common grounds, no unified vision, no common community. And then I heard it spoken by one of these individuals that they regretted, that they were anti-war and they did this in the past, and there was a common ground. And I'm like, no, there wasn't. Pat Buchanan was at the anti-war protest. I got sucked into the right wing through it. No, there wasn't. And you are immature if you pretend like there ever was. In fact, I can't think of a movement in American life that had unified political programs. Hell, I'm not sure I can think of a movement in history that had a clear, unified political program that you could just map out on left and right. As a friend of mine that I commonly argue with reminds me, and he's right about this, partisanship is not a political philosophy. Partisanship is not a political ethics. Partisanship is an allegiance to an abstraction, right? Parties today are not the parties of the 19th century Europe. Mass voter-based parties are low demand. They're not even the parties of Europe now, even though their European parties are increasingly Americanized. They are proxies for an abstraction of identity and community. At the moments when it seems like identity and community are the hardest for people to maintain, unless they're in opposition to someone. I talk about social contagion being a useless category. Not that it isn't real. In fact, there's two cases of it that I think where it is real. Echo social contagion, where people see things that are positive and mimic it because they want the positive results. And in disinhibitive social contagion, where people are allowed to do what they really want to do because the social prohibition's been removed. In the context of mass violence, chaos, moral laxity, etc. And look, moral laxity is not always bad. There's a lot of morals that I don't think are good. But when you're always going on about this or that cultural figure and talking about how this or that abstraction or cultural representation is somehow really violent, but you don't actually talk about the motherfucking violence, the physical, real, people are dead violence, and you try to take very simpleton views of the world, try to reduce everything to things where you can pick a clear side, so because you can win if you pick a clear side, except you can't. You aren't winning when you're subordinating yourself to something else. See, if you read Eichmann's life, Eichmann in Jerusalem doesn't seem as revelatory as the banality of evil stated by Arendt initially was, because Eichmann evil was not banal. But there are a ton of people below Eichmann whose associations really were. They didn't look at things, and why didn't they look at them? How much of your life is like that? See, the despair on immigration is a tough one for me, because I fought with a friend of mine yesterday over the fact that Biden's doing some actions at the southern border that are actually more egregious than Trump. And yes, it really is weird how little outrage is getting. And I got two answers. One is like, well, we don't expect Democrats to be consistent. And I'm like, well, we shouldn't. But yet also, how do you hold anyone accountable if you automatically take their cynicism as a given? And then despair. And I was like, okay, now the despair is the more interesting thing. If we admit that there wasn't a whole lot you could have done at any time, and that the civic resistance didn't work, then what was the point, and who did it serve? Were you really standing up to negative cultural trends in society? Or were you just expressing an allowed valve for them? The funny thing is, you don't need conspiracies for all this work. It's not that conspiracies never happen. I've never said that. But most of them can involve multiple people, of the more than 20 variety, because it's just too hard to maintain. And I've been surprised at the utter inability of whole sectors of society to respond to things. Take the Cy Hurst article. I've read one piece that responds to it, talks about the problems with its sources, talks about some issues there. Now, I have pointed out that Cy Hurst has been right a lot in his career, but also people ignore the places he's been wrong. I pointed out that the Substack release means that there's no editorials chasing it. But when I say that, of course, the people who think I should be celebrating Substack come at me and saying I'm blaming Cy Hurst, and actually I'm being very clear. It's the media's own market model that made things like Substack and the inability to have editorial rooms the case, because that didn't start with Substack. Substack just figured out how to make charging for blogging cheaper. I mean, honestly, the aggregate blog newsletter is actually kind of funny, because it's just paying for a blog, and it's just having a newsletter that the RSS feed is on a private blast for. It's not actually card technology. We could have done this 20 years ago. The thing is, there was no reason to do it, and individuals who did it couldn't build up enough of a audience. Well, now they can, because it's just easier than trying to read through the various publications, and no one really trusts the publications anymore anyway. Whose fault is that? Is that Cy Hurst's fault? No. But what amazed me, and I'll share the article that I saw that actually dealt with it. When I read and looked at Reuters and the AP, I literally saw no response. There was some quotes of politicians, there was a list of Cy Hurst's CV, and there was silence. Now, whether or not you agree with Cy Hurst is irrelevant to my point. What is very relevant is, like, you can't even get official journalist channels to do anything but the most cursory reporting. They're not even doing investigations of the sources, talking about how many they were, talking about the issues there. There's no guidance whatsoever, no actual reporting except for the most vague, superficial level. And the AP and Reuters used to be much better. Talking to my conservative brother, yes, one of my brothers is a conservative. How surprising. He's formerly working class and rose up. As I've already talked about, survivor's bias tends to do that. But I want to ask you a question. We both agreed that all the cable news channels are useless because they're basically stenographers for political spin, not any kind of political information. And only old people are dumb enough to trust them. But nothing's replaced them. The alternative media is no better. What do you get from most things on YouTube? You find people who tell you want what you want to believe, and you find people who encourage your 5 minutes hate. That is a form of cultural hegemony. When you're always talking about this or that media figure and their sins, you're keeping them in the news. You're setting up a kind of paramoral institution around them. I mean, getting canceled now no longer is really as that effective, and it's also like a parallel institution, and you see people get addicted to baiting people to cancel them because it will guarantee them a kind of vice signaling audience. How effective is any of that at this point? It's effective only in sorting out some proxy for political morality that most people can't be consistent about and don't have. Why don't they have it is a more interesting question than that they don't have it, though. And that's kind of what I'm getting at here. The thing is about cultural hegemony is everyone thinks they're not affected by it. I'm affected by it. I did a show where we talked a lot about neofolk and all this other stuff and its right-wing or left-wing tendencies. And you know what? I'm embarrassed by that because that's a distraction. Just like going in and listening to a show that focuses on the most obscure right-wingers and doesn't focus on the people who are killing massive amounts of people in our society is a distraction. Yes, those other groups are often dangerous. Yes, you should avoid the Order of the Nine Angles or Atomwaffen. Just like you should avoid certain Islamic terrorist groups from 10 years ago. But the people who focus solely on that were almost always distracting you from more destructive policies. The banality of evil and the 5 minutes hates and the focus on pop culture keeps you from looking at the driving forces behind them. Even Michael Sandel, whose framework I totally talked about and legitimized, I think he doesn't deal with the economic forces behind this. He treats it as a matter of cultural will and as a matter of community coherence, but doesn't ask what's the economic reasons that this community coherency is impossible, even if people seem to want it. Why, if you can present to individuals in your vision about civic republicanism versus the administrative state versus the administrative state in constant crisis that only defines itself in negative partisan, why can't you actually intervene in that? Well, because there are other forces driving it. You want to intervene in it, you have to look at the complex things driving those forces. That requires systemic and not individual viewpoints. But it also requires something that I may have underestimated in the past. And that is actually a normative positive vision. What does it mean to have norms, to have values, to have an overriding ethic? What does it mean to organize your life around those things? You see, the whole point of Marxism is that we admitted that people completely did not think their way to anything, that it wasn't just a matter of belief, that you couldn't just believe in a more equal world to make it, but you could make a more equal world if you believed in it by seeing what makes things do certain things and trying to align yourself with that. Now it's harder and harder to do, as there are elements of Marxism that Marx didn't, there are elements of the economy that I think Marx didn't go into enough. Pricing power, hegemony, the way markets work, finance capital, etc. And there are also elements of which Marxists are stuck in historical Marxist traditions of interpretation that came out of context that no longer exists, but we hold on to it as matters of fact. We don't even agree on definitions, but we throw them around as if we do. And then people will find whatever bad faith examples of whatever tendencies they don't like and use that, condemn the whole tendency as if like belief was some genealogical contagion. And they get mad when people call that anti-communist, but in some ways it's a selectivity response. You're finding bad examples that prove your point, and you're going to double down on that. Everyone does that. Every ideological and political tendency does that. And if you think that's an actual answer to anything, you're often doing that at the expense of people who have real power and damage real lives. The banality of most systems is that there really is cultural hegemony. And it actually, ironically, really doesn't tend to come from the top, but the people who serve the top. And there is a real sense in which that 99 versus 1% actually ignores how much of society is dedicated to preserving parts of the top. Someone comes at me because I hate the PMC thesis, but I'll tell you right now that the bourgeoisie can make money off of investment in such a way that it's not actually that invested in our cultural wars. Occasionally you'll find billionaires throwing money at a loss to do political gains, but honestly, given the number of billionaires there are, there's a lot less of it than people think, than what you would actually predict given how cheap some of those investments are. Furthermore, there's a lot less singular allegiance of the capitalist class to any one party or faction, because it's unclear what's going to restore profitability right now and who gets to restore it and how. And everything I see on offer has problems that people just fundamentally bracket out. There's many things I agree with modern monetary theorists on it, but when they talk about a natural interest rate of 0%, I'm just like, there's no such thing as a natural interest rate, because there's not natural lending in an economy, and people and even animals will sometimes lend for no advantage and sometimes they won't. The reasons for that are complicated. Saying anything as abstract as an interest rate has a natural rate tends to do something. And yet, if you were honest with yourself, if the interest rate is 0% and people already have massive amounts of capital, then they have an advantage in the game of accumulation. So there's one point that doesn't seem to be on the side of anything but rentiers. That's a different part of the economy, of the bourgeois economy, that's not being looked at. A lot of Marxists want to do things like go back to looking at the economy as if we were on commodity money or even commodity-backed money, or if there was a clear one-to-one relationship to commodity. And we could just talk about this in the terms of capitalism volume of Capital Volume 1. While there's a lot of good stuff in Capital Volume 1, and I would tell everyone to read it, it does not explain all the economy to you. It explains the conditions as understood and the critique of political economy of which Marx was writing about. And there's a lot of assumptions Marx makes because they were made in political economy in general. And some of those assumptions are helpful and some of them aren't. But a whole lot of Marxists want to reduce Marxism to some kind of vague, nebulous ethical position they can't even articulate. And they'll say they're not being ethical, but then they don't actually take any of the theoretical commitments in Marx himself of any seriousness, and they'll go to other thinkers for all their political questions. Without admitting that that actually proves that the idea of an orthodox Marxism is a null and void point. People were into these historical imagos. Trotskyism was big now. Marxist-Leninism is big. Both of them are LARPing. But so much of life is LARPing. Let's be honest, most churches are LARPing too. Most religious groups are LARPing. When your church can't offer a countervalence to the dominant institutions of society, it means that it itself is no longer a dominant institution of society. All I can do is respond. How many divorced Catholics do you know? Particularly the religious variety. The conservative ones that really try to be consistent, except when it's hard. Why don't we ask more about that? The same true, however, much of the left and liberalism, when there's just whole swaths of, we're like, well, there's no ethical consumption other than capitalism, but we're not going to look at people who work for defense contractors. My friends, an absolute and a relative morality are different things. And yeah, there might be no absolutely ethical consumption. Look, there might be no absolutely peaceful consumption in life. One of the things that you go through, if you go through like ancient Buddhist texts, talk about even being a vegetarian means that you're probably ripping life forms apart or denying their land or whatever. But there is relative morality. There's also relative political coherence. A lot of people I know, when you ask them what their criterion for clarity are, when you ask them, when they pretend to be anti-systemic thinkers, but that they see clearly. You ask them how they would know what clarity would mean, and they just get angry with you and take it as a personal challenge. And that tells you a lot of what you need to know, actually. But you need to think about that in a larger sense. Are you addicted to the 5 minutes hate on the cultural issues that we're supposed to care about that actually just seem to change arbitrarily? Are you always rushing to an end conclusion that is absolutely catastrophic while doing nothing to prevent that catastrophe at all? Other than maybe shaming people? and you don't even see how that's part of the feedback loop of the very thing you hate, if you can't look at these things, you are totally immersed in them. And you can't be non-responsive to them. There's no way I can pretend that I can just stand above all the culture war. No one I know who tries to remotely does. In fact, I become even more obsessed with it. But I can be disciplined about when I'm willing to call out names, to engage in shaming, to not engage in shaming, to be tolerant but not totally indulgent, etc. And I can be honest that there's a banality to a lot of what we allow when we're chasing a lot of these, frankly, what amounts to moral panics. And it's not that many of the things that concern moral panics aren't important. That's actually one of the ironic things about the way people throw that out. Oh, you're saying that this isn't important. No, most moral panics are based on something that is important, but is used in a way that obscures you from seeing reality. And you still have to believe in it. You still believe that there's a objective reality out there. I have read a lot of Baudrillard to people. Someone like, well, can someone give me a book that on Baudrillard's key conceptions? And the question is actually kind of hard because his key conceptions, other than simulacra and simulation and some other things, evolved throughout his career. But one of the things that I've noticed about him is while he's often good at finding examples of specific kinds of thinking, there's also a very nebulous they in his work. Classes are often not really mentioned. Capitalism is declared to be over all the time. Sometimes at moments where it's particularly ironic that it's being declared and no one holds him accountable for it. Now, he's an interesting thinker, but there's a huge gaps. And when I point these gaps out, I get some excuse about how I don't really understand what Baudrillard is saying, and that there's some third thing that you have to know to really, which is a way of avoiding the fact that, no, my friends, a lot of the times the plain reading is the truth, and B, even when that is the case, there's a lot of avoidance. Well, why isn't that being made in this argument right now? Why do you have to understand all this prior stuff to understand this particular way of speaking? That's a very strange requirement of having people engage with you, that you can't take anything in its own context and try to, deduce from it. And I realize that a lot of people who come out of academia are inculcated in fandoms as well. That are devoted to protecting careers and interpretive traditions of which they can be key members, and not in dealing with what's said in the text. And that's the problem of humanities academia. That's a way to get your corner on the market. It's not working anymore, by the way. It's kind of a maladaptive strategy now, but nonetheless. There's a lot of things I wish people would not talk as much about because they don't know. Or if they talked about it, they'd be more willing to caveat it with, I don't really know. Here's what I think is most likely given my priors. And a lot of people interpret that as cowardice. No, a lot of you, if I'm honest, I think a lot of people who throw the words moral coward around are actually cowards themselves. The last thing they want to deal with is uncertainty. And they think false certainty is somehow an answer to that. Or at least, even if they don't think that, they act like it. I'm often called arrogant a lot, or assuming I have perfect knowledge for critiquing people for like bad assertions or problematic trends. They don't deny that they're trends, and they don't deny that what I'm saying is right. And the thing is, a lot of times I'm actually explicitly stating I don't have perfect knowledge, that no one has perfect knowledge. What I have is an ability to critique myself and then apply that broadly. I've been wrong on many things. Trying to predict what individual actors are going to do in the world, trying to predict that the left won't be fooled by this or that and the other, trying to predict even what the left is. I don't know what it is anymore. I know when most people try to deviate from the left, they go right wing, and I know that people try to tell me that, well, the right wing's more accepting, and in many ways they are. I've been over there, but they're also just as dysfunctional. But the thing is, there's something, you got to have a ground of reality more than like who your peer group is. That's a heuristic for knowledge and trust, but it's actually kind of a bad one in such an environment, particularly when there's no community to build up that trust. There's nothing you're actively doing with people in a day-to-day life that makes you trust them as comrades. That's what your trust should be based off of. Not extrapolations from nominal political orientations. You should trust the people that you've seen deliver things for you and that who you know and work with, regardless of some of their nominal political affiliations. And that's the bigger issue. You shouldn't expect everything to be perfectly coherent. It's not going to be. We live in a highly conflictual and contradictory society. You don't just will that undone. But the people who don't bother with coherence at all, you probably shouldn't trust either. But the idea that someone's going to be perfectly coherent all the time, if they are, they're lying to themselves. But the idea that you shouldn't even attempt it, that's giving everyone a free pass. The banality of cultural hegemony is that so much of it just keeps you from looking at the larger and more real and direct violences in the world for a media circle that keeps you commenting on it and addicted to it. It's not a good thing. Like and subscribe if you want to. I don't really care.